Cool. Let's speak to Edmund Fitton-Brown now, former British ambassador to Yemen, currently senior advisor at the Counter-Extremism Project. Thank you so much for joining us. I'll put that question to you. Has Donald Trump been vindicated?
Well, I think it's a little early to say because, of course, we're told there's going to be a ceasefire. And I don't think that President Trump would have made the claim if he didn't feel he had good reason to do so. But these things are always uncertain. So let's at least reserve judgment. And also worth striking a note of caution that ceasefires don't always hold. Precisely so. Even if it does come into effect, it could then be broken. And of course, it's worth bearing in mind that this came off the back of attempted Iranian retaliatory strikes on a US airbase in Qatar. How significant was that? Because whilst on the face of it, it looked like, classic retaliation by Iran, in the grand scheme of things, the Americans had advance warning of it. There were no US casualties. The Qatari air defences intercepted those missiles. What was that designed to do? Was that a face-saving exercise on the part of Iran? It seems clear that it was purely a face-saving exercise. If you think about it, the Israelis are now on day 11 of Operation Rising Lion, and they've been dominating the skies over Iran for most of that time. And they've had some major hits recently on Evin Prison and on the Basij internal security forces. And the Americans got involved briefly, but very, very dramatically. Now, for the Iranians to content themselves with an attack on the airbase in Qatar, which they appear to have given the Qataris advance notice of, and there were no casualties, that looks to me as if the Iranians are seeking a way out of this. And by giving the Qataris advance notice, presumably Qatar then just tell America. Yes, precisely. And I think Donald Trump sort of, again, in that rather sort of direct way of his, said, we knew in advance. So he's not helping the Iranians to save face, but it's probably good enough. And if this ceasefire is true, is to be believed, and it does hold, clearly you can understand why it's in Donald Trump's interest to play the peacemaker and say, look, my diplomacy has worked here. Is it in Iran's interest right now to have a ceasefire? I think it is, and the reason why I think it is just that they have sustained such damage over the past 11 days, and they have this constant humiliation of their people knowing that the skies are not their own, that they're completely controlled by the enemy. And of course, they have always talked about Israel as being the enemy. So with having lost so much military equipment and now having had the Americans come in with the implicit threat of a lot more to come if there was a serious Iranian escalation, I think it's time probably for the Iranians to want to get out of it. And then on the flip side, is it in Israel's interest? Yeah, I wondered about that when I first heard about the ceasefire, because you think, well, Donald Trump must have had some level of assurance from both sides. And I understand that there have been reports of the fact that the Israelis are also at least aware of this and looking to cooperate with it. And of course, from the Israeli point of view, that what they can't do is embarrass Donald Trump. When the Americans entered this conflict and took out those 3 sites, assuming that they were completely taken out, that was very much the answer to the Israelis' request, and they were very, very happy with it. And so I think in present circumstances, they need to make sure that Donald Trump feels that he is being respected. So my guess is they will make the best they can of the remaining time before the ceasefire kicks in, but then they probably will comply. Even though, Netanyahu was quite clear after Israel launched those initial strikes on the Iranian nuclear sites, he delivered an address to the Iranian people calling on them to rise up and overthrow the mullahs. And so in a sense, he wanted regime change. He hasn't got that, but you think the most important thing for Netanyahu is keeping Trump on side? I think so. And I think there's an interesting point about regime change. That's been a little bit of a tussle over in the United States as well, within the Republican Party, people saying, are we for regime change or not? The reality is that foreign-imposed regime change is difficult to achieve, and it often goes wrong. But if you ask the question in a different way and say, would we like to see a change of government in Tehran, the answer is obviously yes. Now, my take on this is that if the ceasefire does take effect and the Israelis withdraw, and obviously Americans stay away from it for now, and the Iranians also accept it. In some ways, that probably does create the ideal conditions for regime change, because Iran will then be left to pick up the pieces of what has obviously been a very unsuccessful military campaign.
But what is regime change in Iran look like? Because whilst you might hope that you get a liberal democratic leader in a kind of Jeffersonian democracy tradition, realistically, that's very unlikely. Is there not a risk that you just get a younger, frankly shrewder Ayatollah in the place of Khomeini?
Well, I think your skepticism is very reasonable, and I think that's the inevitable conclusion of previous wars where you've had mission creep and you've tried for nation building. I think this might be different for a number of reasons. One is that there's been a series of rounds of effectively civil society protest against the regime, and they've been put down brutally, but they have been increasingly serious each time that they've happened. The other reason is that the Iranian population is exceptionally well educated and literate, and it is a great civilization, the Persian civilization. And there's a sense in which the population has lost patience with a regime that's now 45 years old and has become sclerotic and corrupt as well as brutal. So I think you're much more likely to get a change for the better in a country like Iran than you would be, for example, in a country like Libya.
And do you think we could see the regime fall in a matter of months even?
I think that's possible. I certainly wouldn't want to put money on it. I think that certainly if we imagine that this ceasefire happens, and then, as I said, the Iranian authorities are in the position of having to pick up the pieces of this unsuccessful campaign, they're going to have a really difficult job explaining what this was all for.
Edmund, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us. Edmund Fitton-Brown there, former British ambassador to Yemen, currently a senior advisor at the Counter-Extremism Project. Really keen to hear from you this morning as well.